The American frontier was a lawless expanse where justice wore a tin star and morality came second to survival. While Hollywood has immortalized figures like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, there are countless outlaws whose stories remain buried beneath layers of dust and deliberate omission. These are the rogues, bandits, and desperados whose tales were too scandalous, too complex, or too uncomfortable for the silver screen. Their crimes were brutal, their motivations murky, and their legacy stained with blood that no amount of revisionist history could wash clean. Pearl Hart stands as one of the most enigmatic figures of frontier crime, a woman who defied every convention of her era. In 1899, she committed one of the last stagecoach robberies in American history, wielding a revolver with the same determination that had driven her from a respectable Canadian upbringing into the Arizona desert. Her story began with an abusive marriage and descended into a life of gambling, morphine addiction, and petty crime before culminating in that fateful holdup near Globe, Arizona. What makes her tale particularly scandalous is not just her gender, but the way she manipulated public sympathy, claiming she needed money for her dying mother. The truth was far less noble. She had abandoned her children years earlier and was supporting a violent lover named Joe Boot. When captured, she used her femininity as both weapon and shield, posing for photographs in men's clothing and giving interviews that portrayed her as a victim of circumstance. The court initially acquitted her, unable to reconcile the image of womanhood with armed robbery, but a second trial finally sent her to the Yuma Territorial Prison. Even there, she became pregnant by an unknown man, leading to her early release and disappearance into obscurity. Hollywood has avoided her story because it presents a woman who was neither victim nor heroine, but simply a criminal who exploited every advantage available to her. Augustine Chacon terrorized the Arizona-Sonora border region with a brutality that made even hardened lawmen shudder. Between 1895 and 1902, he murdered at least 30 people, though some estimates place the number closer to 50. His preferred method was ambush, striking from the desert like a rattlesnake and leaving no witnesses. What distinguishes Chacon from other frontier killers was his complete lack of motive beyond sadism. He did not rob for wealth or kill for revenge. He murdered because it brought him pleasure. When he finally faced execution in 1902, he showed no remorse, instead laughing at the crowd gathered to watch him hang. His last words were a boast about the men he had killed and the women he had violated. The rope broke during his first hanging, and witnesses reported that he smiled as they prepared the noose again. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, but legend says that souvenir hunters dug it up and scattered his bones across the desert. No film has ever depicted Chacon because his crimes offer no redemption arc, no tragic backstory, only pure malevolence that challenges our need to understand criminal motivation. The Hart brothers, Mikeja and Wiley, operated along the frontier during the late 1700s, making them America's first documented serial killers. Their reign of terror across Kentucky and Tennessee left dozens dead, including their own infant daughter, whom Mikeja killed by smashing her head against a tree because her crying annoyed him. They murdered travelers, settlers, and anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path, often disemboweling their victims and filling the body cavities with stones before sinking them in rivers. What makes their story particularly disturbing is that they traveled with 3 women who bore their children and participated in the crimes, creating a family unit built entirely around murder. When Mikeja was finally captured, a posse decapitated him and stuck his head on a pole as a warning. Wiley escaped and continued killing under various aliases until he was finally hanged in 1804. The psychological complexity of their crimes, the involvement of women and children, and the sheer depravity of their methods have kept Hollywood at a distance. There is no way to romanticize men who killed for sport and raised their children in an environment of constant violence. Tom Bell led one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in Gold Rush, California, yet his name barely registers in frontier history. A physician turned outlaw, Bell organized a gang that operated with military precision, robbing stagecoaches and mining camps across the Sierra Nevada. What set him apart was his intelligence and planning. He scouted targets weeks in advance, planted informants in towns, and executed robberies with clockwork efficiency. His downfall came in 1856 when his gang attempted to rob a stagecoach carrying a Wells Fargo shipment. The robbery went wrong, resulting in the death of a woman passenger, something Bell had explicitly forbidden. The killing turned public opinion against him and led to a massive manhunt. When captured, he was hanged without trial by a vigilante committee. The scandal surrounding Bell is not his crimes but his background. He was educated, articulate, and came from a respectable family. His descent into outlawry had no clear trigger, no tragic event that pushed him over the edge. He simply chose crime because it suited him, a fact that undermines the narrative of outlaws as products of their harsh environment. Rattlesnake Dick Barter earned his colorful nickname not from any serpentine qualities, but from his early days prospecting near Rattlesnake Bar in California. By the mid-1850s, he had abandoned mining for robbery, becoming one of the most successful stagecoach bandits in the state. His gang operated with remarkable efficiency, stealing over $80,000 in gold during their peak years. What makes his story scandalous is his relationship with law enforcement. Evidence suggests that several sheriffs and deputies were on his payroll, providing information about gold shipments and looking the other way during robberies. When one of his gang members was captured and turned informant, Rattlesnake Dick found himself hunted by the very men who had once protected him. He died in a shootout in 1859, but the circumstances remain suspicious. Some historians believe he was assassinated by corrupt lawmen who feared he would expose their involvement. His story has been buried because it reveals the deep corruption that existed in frontier law enforcement, challenging the myth of the righteous lawman standing against criminal chaos. Cherokee Bill, born Crawford Goldsby, was of mixed African-American, Cherokee, and white heritage, a fact that made him an outsider in every community. He turned to crime in his teens, joining the Cook Gang in Indian Territory and quickly establishing himself as the group's most violent member. Between 1894 and 1895, he killed at least 8 people, often shooting victims who posed no threat simply because they looked at him wrong. His most notorious crime occurred when he shot a conductor on a train for refusing to stop at his preferred station. When captured and imprisoned, he attempted a jailbreak that resulted in another murder. He was hanged in 1896 at the age of 20, reportedly saying, "This is about as good a day to die as any," before the trapdoor opened. Hollywood has avoided Cherokee Bill because his story forces a confrontation with the racism and social exclusion that shaped frontier violence. He was neither a freedom fighter nor a misunderstood youth, but a killer whose mixed heritage left him belonging nowhere and caring for no one. The Bender family operated an inn along the Osage Trail in Kansas during the early 1870s, offering food and lodging to travelers. What guests did not know was that the Benders were serial killers who murdered at least 11 people, possibly many more. Their method was simple and brutal. While a guest sat at the dinner table, one of the Benders would strike them from behind with a hammer. Then the family would cut their throat, strip the body, and bury it in the orchard behind the house. They targeted wealthy travelers, stealing their money and possessions. In 1873, the murders were discovered when a man searching for his missing brother found the bodies. The Benders fled before they could be arrested, disappearing so completely that despite massive manhunts and numerous reported sightings, they were never found. Theories about their fate range from death in a shootout with vigilantes to successful escape and new lives under assumed names. The scandal of the Bender family is multifaceted. They were a family unit that killed together, including a daughter who may have used sexual allure to attract victims. They murdered in their home, violating the sacred concept of hospitality, and they escaped justice, denying the frontier narrative its required conclusion of punishment for wrongdoing. Black Bart was a gentleman bandit who robbed 28 Wells Fargo stagecoaches between 1875 and 1883, yet never fired a shot or harmed a passenger. He worked alone, appearing suddenly with a shotgun and a flour sack over his head, politely requesting the strongbox before vanishing into the California wilderness. He left behind poems at several robbery sites, signed Black Bart, the poet, mocking the authorities who could not catch him. What made his story scandalous was his true identity. When finally captured, he was revealed to be Charles Bowles, a respected mining engineer who lived in San Francisco, attended the opera, and was considered a pillar of the community. He had a wife and children who had no idea about his double life. The revelation shattered the assumption that criminals could be identified by appearance or social class. After serving 4 years in San Quentin, he was released and disappeared, with some evidence suggesting he continued robbing stagecoaches under a new method. Wells Fargo allegedly paid him a stipend to stop, though this was never confirmed. Hollywood has touched on Black Bart but never fully explored him because his story suggests that respectability is a mask anyone can wear, and that the line between law-abiding citizen and criminal is thinner than we want to believe. Boone Helm was a cannibal who operated across the frontier from California to Montana during the 1850s and 1860s. He killed at least 5 people and ate portions of their flesh, claiming it was necessary for survival, though evidence suggests he did it by choice. His first known murder was his own friend during a snowstorm in the mountains. When rescued, Helm had strips of the man's flesh in his pack. Rather than face trial, he escaped and continued his wandering violence. He killed a prospector in Oregon, a settler in Washington, and 2 miners in Montana. His boasts about cannibalism made him infamous, but many dismissed the claims as frontier tall tales until witnesses confirmed them. He was finally hanged in 1864 as part of a mass execution of road agents in Virginia City, Montana. As the noose tightened, he reportedly shouted, "Every man for his principles. Hurrah for Jeff Davis. Let her rip." The scandal of Boone Helm is not just his cannibalism, but the way frontier society initially tolerated him. He was arrested multiple times but escaped or was released because witnesses disappeared or refused to testify. His story reveals a darker truth about frontier justice. It was often arbitrary, delayed, and dependent on who the victim was. Flora Quick, known as Tom King, spent years living as a man on the frontier, working as a cowboy, prospector, and eventually an outlaw. She joined a gang of cattle rustlers in Wyoming during the 1870s, participating in raids and shootouts without her companions knowing her biological sex. Her deception was only discovered when she was wounded in a gunfight and required medical treatment. The revelation caused a sensation, but rather than face trial, she disappeared into the frontier, possibly resuming her male identity elsewhere. What makes her story scandalous is not the cross-dressing itself, but what it revealed about frontier assumptions. She had proven herself as capable as any man in the violent world of cattle rustling, yet once her sex was known, she could no longer participate in that world. Her story has been buried because it challenges both the masculine mythology of the frontier and the Victorian ideals of womanhood that supposedly governed even the wildest territories. The Reno brothers of Indiana organized the first peacetime train robbery in American history in 1866, stealing over $10,000 and pioneering a crime that would define the frontier era. Frank, John, Simeon, and William Reno led a gang that terrorized the Midwest, robbing trains, banks, and county treasuries with brazen efficiency. What made them particularly dangerous was their willingness to use extreme violence. They killed witnesses, burned homes of those who testified against them, and threatened entire communities into silence. Their reign ended in 1868 when vigilantes stormed the jail where they were being held and lynched them, hanging all 4 brothers from the same beam. The scandal surrounding the Renos is not their crimes but their execution. The lynching was carried out by respected citizens, including business owners and civic leaders, who believed the legal system would not deliver justice. The governor knew about the planned lynching but did nothing to stop it. Hollywood has avoided the Reno brothers because their story forces an examination of vigilante justice and the complicity of authorities in extrajudicial killings. Ike Clanton survived the gunfight at the OK Corral by running away, a fact that has made him a footnote in frontier history. But his survival allowed him to continue a criminal career that included cattle rustling, stage robbery, and murder. He spent years after the gunfight trying to kill Wyatt Earp and his brothers, participating in ambushes that left Morgan Earp dead and Virgil Earp crippled. What makes Clanton scandalous is not his cowardice at the OK Corral but his persistence. He was a mediocre criminal who survived through luck and the willingness to let others take risks while he stayed safe. He was finally killed in 1887 by a detective while fleeing from a cattle rustling charge, shot in the back while running away, dying as he had lived. His story has been marginalized because it presents an outlaw without any redeeming qualities, not brave, not skilled, not even particularly successful, just a persistent criminal who caused harm until someone finally stopped him. Laura Bullion was the only woman to ride with Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, participating in train robberies and serving as a lookout and accomplice. She was involved in the robbery of a Great Northern train in 1901, which netted the gang over $40,000. When arrested, she served 5 years in prison, one of the few members of the Wild Bunch to face justice. After her release, she disappeared into anonymity, possibly working as a seamstress in Memphis until her death in 1961. What makes her story scandalous is how she has been written out of Wild Bunch history. Films about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid ignore her completely, erasing her participation because it complicates the masculine buddy narrative. She was not a prostitute or a victim, but an active participant in robberies, yet her role has been minimized to preserve a certain version of frontier mythology. The Bloody Espinosas, Felipe and Vivian, along with their nephew Jose, killed at least 32 people across Colorado in 1863, possibly many more. They claimed to be avenging the deaths of family members killed during the Mexican-American War and the loss of their land to American settlers. Their victims were chosen seemingly at random, ambushed while traveling or working their claims. They mutilated bodies, leaving them in grotesque displays meant to terrorize the population. The killing spree ended when a tracker named Tom Tobin hunted them down, killing Jose and bringing his head back in a sack as proof. The scandal of the Espinosas is multifaceted. They were motivated by genuine grievances over land theft and violence against Mexicans, yet their response was to murder innocent people who had nothing to do with those crimes. Their story forces a confrontation with the violence of American expansion and the cycle of revenge it created. Hollywood has buried their tale because it presents no clear heroes, only victims and killers caught in a historical tragedy with no satisfying resolution. Henry Plummer was elected sheriff of Bannack, Montana, in 1863, a position he used to run a gang of road agents who robbed and murdered throughout the gold fields. He planned robberies based on information he gathered as sheriff, directed his gang to targets, and used his authority to protect them from prosecution. His double life was eventually exposed by vigilantes who hanged him and over 20 of his associates in 1864. What makes Plummer's story scandalous is the debate that still surrounds it. Some historians argue he was guilty as charged, a corrupt lawman who betrayed his oath. Others contend he was innocent, framed by vigilantes who wanted control of the gold fields and used him as a scapegoat. The evidence is contradictory and incomplete. He may have been the criminal mastermind depicted in vigilante accounts, or he may have been a victim of frontier politics and mob justice. This ambiguity has kept Hollywood away because audiences demand clear moral lines, and Plummer's story offers only uncertainty. Cattle Kate, born Ella Watson, was lynched in Wyoming in 1889, accused of cattle rustling though she was likely innocent. She was a homesteader who accepted cattle as payment for meals and other services, a common practice on the frontier. Wealthy cattlemen, angry at homesteaders fencing off range land, accused her of rustling and hanged her along with her partner James Averill. She was the first woman lynched in Wyoming, and her death sparked outrage across the nation. Witnesses to the lynching were intimidated into silence or disappeared. The cattlemen who killed her were never prosecuted. Her story was deliberately buried by powerful interests who portrayed her as a prostitute and cattle thief to justify the murder. Modern research has revealed that she was neither, just a woman who stood in the way of wealthy men who wanted her land. Hollywood has avoided Cattle Kate because her story is one of injustice without resolution, murder without punishment, and the use of law and reputation as weapons against the powerless. The Buck Gang terrorized Indian Territory in the 1890s, robbing banks, stores, and trains with spectacular violence. Led by Rufus Buck, a Creek Indian, the gang included 5 members who went on a rampage that lasted just 13 days but left a trail of bodies and destruction. They raped women, murdered men, and burned homes, seemingly without any goal beyond chaos. When captured, they showed no remorse, instead posing for photographs and joking about their crimes. All 5 were hanged in 1896, the largest mass execution in the history of Indian Territory. What makes their story scandalous is the randomness of their violence and the youth of the perpetrators. Most were teenagers, and their crimes had no political motivation despite attempts to frame them as resistance to white authority. They were simply young men who decided to see how much destruction they could cause before being stopped. Their story has been buried because it offers no explanation, no social commentary, only senseless violence that serves no narrative purpose. Squirrel Tooth Alice was a dance hall girl and madam in Dodge City who ran a criminal empire that included prostitution, gambling, and robbery. She got her nickname from the gap between her front teeth, which she turned into a trademark, having a diamond set between them. She operated with impunity for years, protected by her relationships with lawmen and politicians who enjoyed her services and shared in her profits. Her downfall came when she murdered a rival madam in a dispute over territory. Even then, she avoided serious punishment, serving only a brief jail sentence before returning to her business. She eventually died of old age, wealthy and unpunished for decades of crime. Her story has been buried because it reveals the hypocrisy of frontier morality. The same communities that claimed to value law and order supported her operations, and the same lawmen who fought outlaws protected her because she provided services they desired. The Dalton brothers attempted to rob 2 banks simultaneously in their hometown of Coffeyville, Kansas, in 1892, an act of hubris that resulted in disaster. Bob Gratt and Emmett Dalton, along with 2 accomplices, entered the banks but were recognized by townspeople who armed themselves and opened fire. The resulting shootout left 4 gang members dead, including Bob and Gratt, and Emmett severely wounded. 4 townspeople also died in the crossfire. What makes this story scandalous is that the Daltons were former lawmen who had turned to crime, and they chose to rob their own town, a place where everyone knew them. Their motivation was partly financial, but also seemed to be about proving something, achieving a robbery so daring it would make them legends. Instead, they became cautionary tales about the consequences of ambition and betrayal. Hollywood has told their story but always sanitizes it, removing the element of community betrayal and the senseless deaths of innocent townspeople caught in the crossfire. Soapy Smith ran a criminal empire in Skagway, Alaska, during the Klondike Gold Rush, controlling the town through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and violence. He operated con games, rigged gambling operations, and robbed miners returning from the gold fields. He presented himself as a civic leader, organizing parades and charity events while his gang robbed and murdered. His reign ended in 1898 when he was killed in a shootout with a vigilante committee. What makes Smith scandalous is how he corrupted an entire town, turning civic institutions into tools of his criminal enterprise. He controlled the police, the courts, and the newspapers, creating a facade of legitimacy while running a thoroughly criminal operation. His story has been marginalized because it demonstrates how easily democratic institutions can be corrupted when citizens are either complicit or too intimidated to resist. The story of these outlaws reveals truths about the frontier that contradict our cherished myths. The West was not a place where good and evil were clearly defined, where justice always prevailed, and where outlaws were romantic rebels against authority. It was a place where violence was common, justice was arbitrary, and morality was negotiable. These buried tales show us criminals who were cowards, psychopaths, and opportunists, operating in communities that were often complicit in their crimes. They show us that women could be as violent as men, that lawmen could be as corrupt as outlaws, and that the line between hero and villain was often impossible to draw. Hollywood has buried these stories not because they are uninteresting, but because they are too interesting, too complex, and too challenging to our need for simple narratives. They force us to confront the reality that the frontier was built on violence, theft, and exploitation, and that many of those who committed crimes were never punished, while many who were punished may have been innocent. These 20 tales represent just a fraction of the buried history of frontier outlaws, stories that deserve to be told not despite their scandalous nature, but because of it, because they reveal who we were, and perhaps who we still are beneath the myths we tell ourselves.